Thanks very much. Okay, so as Ger mentioned, I'm a PhD student based in Athenry, but I suppose at this stage I have been here for a while. So I started my PhD in 2019. So it's based on, I figure out this. It's based on the addition of clovers and herbs to sheep grazed ryegrass sward, looking at the effects of animal and sward performance. So as you've heard this evening already, and you'll know, grazed grass is the most economic feed that we have available, and Ireland's ability to produce grazed grass is probably our biggest competitive advantage. So grazed grass can be up to 6.3 times lower cost than rolled barley when you're comparing that as an energy source. So grazed grass obviously has a seasonal growth pattern, as shown in the green, and what's shown in the blue line on that graph is your flock demand for energy. So the key to profitable base production is trying to time or trying to match the growth pattern of grass to your flock demand. So at the moment, perennial ryegrass accounts for 95% of seed sales in Ireland, and with good reason. There's many advantages to it. But I suppose what we're coming under pressure now is the requirement, that perennial ryegrass requirement for high nitrogen inputs. And that's coming under pressure, as has been mentioned this evening already, in terms of, I suppose, its negative impact on water quality, and has resulted then in these strategies. So for example, the farm to fork strategy, which aims to reduce fertiliser use in the EU by 20% by 2030. So I guess in summary, what that means is we have a requirement for a more sustainable pasture-based production systems, and that's what's led, I suppose, to this study. So the first thing that we looked to try and include in the swards was clover, so red and white clover. Their main benefit being their ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into a form that the plant can use, and they can produce between 100 and 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. They're also associated with improved sward quality, particularly high protein contents, and then that's a driver of improved animal performance and intake. The second element that we looked to include, as Amy has mentioned before, was the herbs. So we were looking at plantain and chicory, and as she mentioned, their main characteristic is a deep taproot. So that taproot then enables them to take up water, trace elements and minerals from deeper in the soil than the ryegrass roots can reach, which is benefit as well in a drought situation. And then they're also associated with reducing the worm burden. So in Athenry, the study that we've undertaken, we looked at 5 sward types. So we looked at ryegrass only as a control, the 2 clover treatments, ryegrass plus white clover and ryegrass plus red clover. Then we looked at perennial ryegrass plus plantain and perennial ryegrass plus chicory. And there's 5 colours there, the green, blue, red, purple and yellow, and they'll be in the following slides if you'd like to follow them that way. I suppose as well, we don't actually have a multi-species treatment in this study, but I suppose a lot of the similar stuff applies across those as well. So for the farmlet study, we wanted to compare those 5 sward types. We wanted to look at animal performance, particularly the lambs in terms of weight gain and drafting, and we also measured some ewe performance. We also looked at sward performance then in terms of sward production, the forage persistency, so how well able to last in the system, especially the clovers and the herbs, and also quality. So I don't actually have any results from the quality part this evening, but I do for most of the rest. So in terms of the study then itself, it ran for 4 years from 2018 to 2021. There was 23 ewes grazing on each of the 5 sward treatments. They were stocked at 11.5 ewes to the hectare. We were using a rotational grazing system, and over the course of that study then we were taking detailed animal and sward measurements. So the first of the results from that trial that I'll show you this evening relates to the lamb performance. So the first line there is pre-weaning average daily gain, and the only sward type to provide us with a benefit there was the addition of red clover. So those lambs were performing better than the grass only in that case. When we looked to the post-weaning performance, then we saw that all of the mixed sward types provided a benefit. So when you had a second element, a clover or herb included in the mixture, your average daily gain post-weaning went up by 22 to 43 grams a day. When you looked what impact then did that have on the lifetime, On the lifetime of the lamb, by grazing on a mixed sward type, their average daily gain was increased by 17 to 31 grams per day, and that allowed them to be finished between 16 and 28 days faster off your farm, which is very significant. And I suppose then, lastly, it led to a decrease in the amount of concentrates that needed to be fed to finish those lambs. So this slide shows lamb drafting patterns, so the proportion of lambs drafted off the different swards across the year. And I suppose it's a very visual representation of lamb performance. You can see that with the addition of red clover or chicory to the sward, they were the highest performing lambs. The addition of white clover or plantain, they had an intermediate level of performance, and they were all performing better than the grass-only lambs. And if you look to this section of the graph in particular, in this system, the lambs don't receive any concentrates until that late October time. And if you just look to the sheer numbers of lambs which are left, on the grass in comparison to those when a mixed sward type, that's the main driver of the reduction in the concentrates fed that was shown in the last slide. So we also looked at Ewe Performance. We looked at scan litter size, so there was no difference. It had no effect on litter size. We also measured milk yield in 2 years of the study. There was no difference there. So the similar milk yield across the 5 groups would explain why we didn't see more significant differences in the lamb performance pre-weaning, because milk yield is a big driver of pre-weaning lamb performance. We weighed and condition scored those ewes at critical time points across the season as well. So there was some differences in ewe weight from 6 weeks post-lambing at weaning and then at the next mating that's shown there, which is the second mating time, so after they had experienced a whole year on the sward type. And there are some differences there, but they wouldn't probably be large enough to have a very significant impact on farm. The differences in condition score that we saw only at the next mating time, they were only a difference of 0.16. So although it's coming up as significant there, you probably wouldn't be able to detect a difference of 0.16 like on a commercial farm. The second thing then is companion forage content. So what I mean by that is the proportion of clovers or herbs that are actually in those swards. And as you can see, they're a lot higher in the post-weaning period than in the pre-weaning period. So the fact that there's low levels in the pre-weaning period is another reason to explain the differences that I've said in the pre-weaning lamb performance. So if there's little clovers or herbs in the swards, that's why we weren't seeing a difference in ewe milk yield, and that's then going back then as to why we didn't see a difference in pre-weaning lamb performance. But you can see that they increased dramatically in the post-weaning period, and that's the main driver of the increased lamb performance post-weaning. So in terms of the sward production, then we saw that they were producing between 10.5 and 11.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, and they were all relatively similar. There was no large differences. So what's worth noting at this point is they were receiving 130 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. Across the board, they were all receiving the same. Previous studies in Athenry that Philip has carried out would show that when a grass-only sward was compared to a grass-white clover sward, the grass-white clover sward could produce the same amount as the grass-only sward when it was receiving 40% less nitrogen. So that is an additional benefit that would be seen and has been mentioned by Jonathan already this evening. Secondly, so forage content, again, the proportion of clovers or herbs in the swards is shown here by phase. And what I mean by phase is in the study we carried out, I suppose, several sowings. So in the phase 1 was the initial sowings that we carried out in Athenry in 2017 and 2018. And as you can see, there was very low levels of clovers and herbs in those swards in year 1. So they didn't establish particularly well at that time. Between that year 1 and year 2, they would have experienced the drought in 2018 when they were relatively young swards, and that obviously had an impact as well. And so by year 2 in those swards, there was very little levels of clovers or herbs left. So we were disappointed with that, but we wanted to go back to the drawing board and see as to why that happened and what we could do to improve it. So in the phase 2, that would be any sowings that had taken place in Athenry in 2019, 20 and 21. So what we did was we brought the timings of the sowings to earlier in the year. We included more clover and herb seed in the mixture. We included less grass seed in the mixture. And overall, there was a much better level of establishment, as you can see. And because we got those to establish a lot better, they persisted a lot better into year 2 than had done in the phase 1. And we would hope that they will, going by those levels, we would hope that they will persist at least into year 3 and further. So that's, I suppose, a positive. So from what happened in the phase 1, we wanted to, I suppose, identify what did go wrong, I suppose, and what could we do to improve the establishment and the persistency of these clovers and herbs in the sward. So we sowed a series of detailed plot trials, and we wanted to look at the different management strategies to see, what effect could our management have. So we wanted to look at establishment method, post-grazing sward height, and seeding rate. So I'll take you through those. So in terms of the establishment method, we sowed these in July 2019, and we measured them for 2.5 years. We did 4 different methods: the conventional, which was a full plough-till sow. We did what we're calling a disc, which was disc harrowed, and then power harrowed and sown. We did power harrow treatment, which was just power harrowed and sown in one pass. And lastly, then the direct drill, which was like no cultivation of the soil, stitched system. And some results from that then, again in terms of companion forage content, the proportion of clovers and herbs in those swards, method had no effect on the proportion of white clover, red clover or chicory in the sward, so it made no difference in terms of that. For the plantain, it did make a difference. So there was more in a perennial ryegrass and plantain sward. There was a lot more plantain in that sward when it was sown by direct drill than it was when it was sown by the conventional plough-till sow. So that was interesting. Secondly, we looked at unsown species or weed contents in these swards. And I suppose, firstly, what you can see is when a second element was included, clover or herbs, there was a reduction in the amount of weeds that were there, and that will likely be as a result of increased competition at the base of the sward when it's establishing. But what I will say is that we did, as you know, you can't use a post-emergent spray when you're including herbs into the mixture, and because we couldn't use it for one, we didn't use it for any of them, so there was no post-emergent spray on any of those sward treatments. So when we look at the effect of the method then, there was an effective method, so there was lower levels of weeds in the direct drill method generally at establishment and in the establishment year, but after that there was no effect, and when you looked at it overall there was no effect, so that effect had kind of disappeared over time. So the second plot trial then looked at post-grazing sward height. It was again sown in July 19, and this time it was measured for 3.5 years because it's a more long-term trend. So we implemented 3 heights of 4 centimetres, which will be quite severe, 4.75 as an intermediate, and 5.5 centimetres as a lax treatment. We looked at companion forage content, and this time I've shown the data there is from year 3, so 2022, so that's after it had repeatedly been grazed to those heights for at least 2 years. If you look to the white clover first, regardless of as to what height you were grazing it to, there was similar levels of white clover left in those swards by year 3. When you look to red clover, there was very little red clover left when you had repeatedly grazed that to 4 centimetres, so quite severe. So the red clover, the severe grazing was damaging the persistence of the red clover. What was interesting was when we looked to the herbs, there was lower levels of plantain and chicory left in those swards when they were grazed to 5.5 centimetres than when they were grazed to 4 and 4.75 centimetres, which is probably not the result that we expected to see, but that's what occurred. The last trial then that we established was looking at varying the seeding rate. So it was sown in June 20, and measured for 2.5 years. So what we did there was we had a total seeding rate of 25 kilos per hectare in all the plots, and then within that 25 we varied the amount of clover or herb seed. So there was 2.55 or 7.5 kilos of clover per hectare, or 2, 3.5 or 5 kilos of herbs per hectare. And if you're more comfortable in acres, I suppose there it's given in red. So for clover, for example, there it's 1 kilo, 2 kilos, or 3 kilos per acre of clover. That's what we were including. So we again looked at companion forage content. So interestingly, as you can see, there was similar levels of white clover content in those swards if it was sown at the low, medium, or high seeding rate. So that shows that there was no benefit of going to the medium or the high seeding rate in this case. So the low was sufficient to establish white clover. I will mention though that even our low level of white clover there was at 1 kilo per acre of naked clover seed, which is a lot higher. It is higher than is included in a lot of the commercial mixes. So it still is important to check how much clover is included in your mixture. When we looked at red clover or plantain, there was a benefit of going to the high seeding rates for those that increased the amount of red clover and plantain in those swards. So that was beneficial there to go to the high seeding rate. And again then for the chicory, there was a benefit of going to the medium seeding rate that increased chicory content in those swards. But for the chicory, there was no benefit of going to the high seeding rate. So the medium seeding rate that we applied there was sufficient to establish chicory. Again, we looked at unsown species or weeds, and when we looked to the perennial ryegrass and plantain, or perennial ryegrass and chicory swards, we saw that there was a trend towards when you went to the higher seeding rate, there was a lower level of weeds in those swards. So that again is probably back to the increased competition at the base of the sward, and the herbs then increase competition, and that's allowing less weeds to establish. So in summary, from the farmlet study, we saw that the addition of a companion forage very significantly increased lamb performance. There was similar Ewe performance on those swards. When we looked at herbage production, it was again similar across all the swards. There were challenges around the forage establishment and persistency, but the phase 2 sowings would show that with more careful management, they can be established successfully. In terms of the plots then, we see that across the board, white clover is very resilient, irrespective of to what method it was sown by, what seeding rate was used, what post-grazing height it was grazed to. There were similar levels of clover across the board. In terms of the method then, plantain was affected by the method of establishment used, where the direct drill was a beneficial there. In terms of the post-grazing height then, the severe grazing to 4 centimetres damaged the red clover content, and the lax grazing to 5.5 centimetres had a negative impact then on the herb contents. And lastly then, I suppose in terms of the seeding rate, we had seen that the low seeding rate that we had applied was enough to establish white clover in a perennial ryegrass and white clover sward. You needed to go to the medium seeding rate when chicory was included, and the high seeding rate then was beneficial when you were including red clover or plantain in the mixture. So thanks very much for your attention. If you have any questions.